So, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is turning his attention to the Lord's Supper. And in that moment, as he leads to what he wants to say about the way that they celebrate the supper together, he introduces it with a very, I think, surprising phrase. He says, "On the night he was betrayed," and then he goes on to tell the story of the Last Supper. On the night he was betrayed, not the night before his death, or when he gathered for the Passover, or not even just, some other way of telling the story. He starts it with this moment of, on the night he was betrayed. Which strikes me as not the way that we would normally introduce the story. Because I think we think of the betrayal of Jesus as being one of the subplots of the story. Whereas for Paul, and really for, I think, the gospel writers too, it's a lot closer to the heart of the story. The next couple of weeks, we are talking about these moments leading up to and at the crucifixion of Jesus. And as we do that, I want us to try to read the crucifixion story, the story of Jesus' death, through the eyes of Mark. The cross is the most familiar part of the story for most of us. And that familiarity is good and it's important because it's part of our devotion to the Lord. It's part of our knowledge of the heart of Jesus' story. But sometimes familiarity blurs our vision. And we read things like we think they're supposed to be, rather than letting the story show us something new. And the cross is one of those places where it's difficult for us to see something new in it because we have such a high degree of familiarity with the story. At least some of the images of the story. And so what I want us to do is I want us to pick up this week and next week in two of the threads that I think are so central to the way that Mark presents the story of the crucifixion. See, I think we tend to get hung up on, and I'm really curious about why this is. I think it's probably because of centuries of the art of the crucifixion and the way, perhaps it's something about our worldview, but we tend to focus on the physical aspects of what happened. You know, the suffering of things like when Jesus was beaten and when he was, nailed to the cross, and the physical aspect of what that pain would have been like. And we tend to focus on that piece of it. But the gospel writers often don't. In fact, they tell us very few details about the actual physical act of crucifixion. Most of that is left to the assumptions of the reader. But they do tell this incredibly told story of betrayal. The betrayal narrative that we have in the Gospel of Mark is incredible. The way that it unfolds. We have earlier in the story, we have this understanding that Jesus is going to Jerusalem to confront the powers that are there and that they will indeed kill him. Jesus has gone to great lengths to share with his disciples the news of what they're heading into. And he makes it very clear that when he's going to Jerusalem to meet his death. And he's clear also when he gives those predictions that we passed through in kind of the middle section of the book. He tells where that death is going to come from, right? He began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Remember all that? That threefold prediction. Jesus says this kind of thing 3 times in the middle chapters of the book. And so we know we're headed to Jerusalem to face the powers. They will turn on Jesus and kill him. But the story unfolds a little bit differently than that, right? Because Jesus goes into the temple and has this big throwdown that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, and the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, all those people named earlier, they have to kind of rethink their tactic and their attack. And remember what it told us, that they wanted to arrest him there in the temple, but they didn't feel like they had kind of the popular heft behind them, and so they went to redraw their plan. You see, it seems like, in the public eye, Jesus is winning the day. Jesus has the upper hand in the temple. And then we have this other story that appears like a subplot to us, but is, I think, right at the heart of the conflict of the story. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." See, they have a puzzle that they can't unravel. They don't know how to get their hands on Jesus in a way that won't cause a big public riot. They don't know how to do it. See, Jesus, to them, just mysteriously shows up in the temple, and then he kind of disappears and vanishes. And then he shows up, and he causes more trouble, and then he's gone again. And they don't know how to, they don't want to confront him in that place, but that's the only place that they ever meet him, where the crowd is. And then we have just a few moments later, these verses that Darrell read to us. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priest in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. And so he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. And Mark is setting the hook for us. How dastardly. What a villain, this Judas. I can't believe that he would take that turn in the story. If we read across that, we're tempted to shake our heads, click our tongues, say, "Oh, Judas, how could you?" But the story goes on, doesn't it? And so then they come to celebrate the Passover. And they're gathered together, and it says, when it was evening, he came with the 12. When they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." This is Jesus playing a very clear role in the story. He is a prophet with knowledge that the other parties don't have. Now the narrator, Mark's already told us who it is. The hand has been tipped, right? And so when we come to this part and Jesus says this, we can look on at the spectacle knowing already that it's Judas. Okay? And then we read, "And they began to be distressed and say to him one after another, 'Surely not I.' And he said to them, 'It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me.'" Somebody here is sharing my salsa bowl, and it's one of them. And that's the only clue that they're going to get. And it's significant because right here at this moment, that wondering about who it is is right at the heart of the story. The disciples looking at each other in suspicion and also having some pride of themselves to say, it's not me. It's not me. Surely not I. Who is it? Go ahead and tell me, Jesus. I know it's not me, but I just don't know who it is. You know, go ahead and tell us. We'll throw him out. Let's get rid of him. It's almost not clear at this point in the story, at least from the perspective of the disciples, they seem to believe that Jesus knows who it is, but Jesus doesn't really tip the hand more than just this vague impression that it is one of them. Why not just call him out? Jesus goes ahead and says, you know, the Son of Man will go as it is written of him, but woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one to have not been born. And then they take the supper there, ostensibly with Judas present among them. How could he? How could he stand it at this point, right? He's already made the deal. I wonder if Judas is there going, he knows it's somebody. I wonder if he knows it's me. See, from Judas's perspective here, all Jesus has said is one of you will betray me. He hasn't said which one. Everybody else is saying, I wonder who it is. Judas is saying, I know who it is. I wonder if he does. And this is where everything is coming into conflict in the story. Will Judas be able to pull off this villainous deed? Will Jesus let him? And then while the spotlight is firmly on that part of the story, Mark undoes it all. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, you will all become deserters. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I'll go before you to Galilee. In the midst of that controversy of there's one of you who will betray me. Who is it? Is it me? It's not me. It's not me. Not me. Jesus lets them sit in that for a little while. And then as they leave, he says, hey, by the way, it's all of you. It's every one of you. Peter can't help it anymore, and so Peter says, Lord, surely not. Even though all become deserters, I will not. And Jesus gives him this prophecy, I'll tell you this day, this very night before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And he said vehemently, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And then it says, and all of them said the same. Every one of them. See, Judas is the headline. But Peter's the story. Judas is the clickbait. The betrayal. But Peter, who will abandon and deny him, and John and James and Thaddeus and all the rest of them, that's where the real story is. It goes on, and the story goes, and when Judas comes and he gives him, points out Jesus and kisses him, and all of them, it says at the end of this story, there's this controversy about the sword. And after that, verse 50, I think Mark 14:50 is the the real critical verse almost in the whole book. It says, all of them deserted him and fled. So we have the show with Judas, and then we just have the abandonment of the rest of the disciples. All of them deserted him and fled. See, the crisis that's happening in this story is never really to us, as we read it, whether or not Jesus will be crucified. Like if we just follow along with Mark, what Mark's trying to do, Mark tries to tell us from the very beginning that Jesus is going to be crucified. But the story he's trying to pull us into is the story of how that came to be. And it's a story of not just the evil powers having their way and using force. It's the story of Jesus' closest friends, his disciples, betraying and abandoning him at the worst possible moment. That's why Jesus has gone through this whole story of telling the disciples exactly what's going to happen 3 different times, right? And then as they come into Jerusalem, and there's this moment where Jesus is telling them that there's going to be somebody to betray him. He even warns them that they're going to be deserting him. And there's this conflict about whether that's going to happen or not. The thread that I want us to see as we look at the story of the cross is this thread of betrayal. Jesus didn't just die. He wasn't just captured by the Romans. It was his friends. It was his friends. That story, that emphasis of the story is a critical thing for us to grasp. Because we are tempted to look into the story and see all the power players as the villains. But Mark just kind of assumes they're like that. What is surprising and unnerving is how even Jesus' closest disciples fail to be faithful. Faithfulness is a word that our world cares about more than it thinks it does. The ability or the capacity of humans to stay faithful and our propensity to betray each other is not just a critical theme in this story, but in most stories. I mean, I've been thinking lately about how so many stories in the popular arena that are being told have this thread of betrayal as part of them, right? Or at least the suspicion of it. Like it's the crisis that a lot of time has to be unwound. There isn't a love story that's worth its salt that doesn't have in it somewhere a crisis of faithfulness. Forget the love stories. I was watching a Marvel show this week. Daggum superheroes. But you know what it was about? It wasn't about a crisis about whether the superhero can defeat the villain or not. It was about whether they could remain a team and work together even in the face of a betrayal. And we tell that story all the time. And you know why we tell stories about betrayal all the time? It's because we experience it all the time. So people work together for years and years to be business partners, and they build a business together, and then one day one of them sees an opportunity, and all they have to do to become more wealthy and have more power and prestige is sell out their longtime partner, and it happens in the blink of an eye, right? Family has thrived for years. Seems as solid as can be, but a moment of betrayal blows it all apart. Any arena that we see, from the way that things that we follow in our own personal relationships, our business relationships, politics, sports, it's all about who will be faithful. We expect it. And yet we seem unable to sustain it. And the story of Jesus tells us that story because it wants every one of us who knows the same pain that psalm we read at the beginning of worship today, Psalm 55, which is the pain of someone who feels like they are being oppressed and they've been stabbed in the back, not by an enemy, but by a friend. And we know what that feels like, don't we? Do you know? Man, it hurts. It is the worst. And it's strange that we focus on the story of the crucifixion and we focus on the physical pain parts of it. But I think for most of it, if we had to choose between the physical torture of the crucifixion and the total abandonment and betrayal of all our friends, which would you choose? Because that betrayal thing is the worst, man. When you feel like that, it feels like your whole world has blown apart and you just don't want to be a part of it anymore. And I think part of what's happening in this story is that Mark wants us to realize, in the way it portrays Jesus and his humanity and his solidarity with us, Mark wants you to know that Jesus knows betrayal. He's experienced that. He's felt that sense of what it means to be left alone and abandoned. Jesus knows betrayal. He's felt the very worst of it. And the worst of what humanity has is wrapped up in this experience of betrayal. But there's more in this story for us too. And it comes in, I think Peter is the best representative of it, but it's something that all of them say, right? They are all wondering who it is that's going to betray them. They're all saying it's not going to be me. They all deny that they will deny. And their pride is put on display. They are so proud of being Jesus' disciples. They are so proud of their faithfulness. And that pride is keeping them from seeing straight. And it's keeping them from being able to understand exactly really where they are in the story. Pride is a liar. And part of the story, I think, that Mark wants us, who know ourselves to be his disciples, part of what he wants us to know is that in these moments, we have to have the humility to say about ourselves, we are always just one weak moment away from betrayal. Not from experiencing it, but from doing it to somebody else and even to the Lord. This story evokes profound humility in those who would be Jesus' disciples. And it wants us to say, come into the story, but know that Jesus doesn't call you to be part of his mission because you have an airtight sense of faithfulness. Because like Greg said, Jesus calls even his betrayers to the table. But there's another word in this story for us. And it is something that actually we picked up on last week. Remember the last word that we had at the end of chapter 13, where Jesus is talking to the people there, and he's talking about the end of Jerusalem that's coming soon, and the trouble that's going to come on them, and what it means. That last word, he says, "What I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." Well, in this story of betrayal and abandonment, that comes up again, right? Because after they go to the garden, after they go to the garden, there's this moment where Jesus, or while they're there, Jesus goes and he's praying to God, this famous prayer. For you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. He goes and he prays this 3 times. And as he does it, each time he returns to his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. And he finds them sleeping. In my text, in my translation, the way it says, stay awake, keep awake, I want you to pick up on this thread. Mark wants us to see this. He began to, and he said to them, this is 14:34. He said to them, I am deeply grieved even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And then he goes and he comes back in verse 37. He came and found them sleeping. And so in verse 38, he's going again. He says, he says, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake for 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again, he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and he did not know what to say to them. He came a 3rd time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And then the story, of course, unfolds from there. But you see, what Peter doesn't understand in his pride of denial is that he doesn't have the capacity to stay awake. Jesus knows this about him. And so he gives to Peter the same word that he gave those who were hearing his prophecies about the end of the temple and perhaps the end of time. And he says the same thing to Peter that he said to them. Keep awake. You know, that phrase right there is more central to what it means to be a disciple than we recognize. Because it's not that we are lacking in intentions. It's that we just find ourselves in weakness. And Jesus prepares us for that, giving us the warning, stay awake, stay awake. But the last thing I want to say about this piece of the story is that even though the telling of this focuses in many ways on the disciples' inability to be faithful, as they scurry away, Jesus is left in the spotlight, and the question will become, what about him? And the story answers with a resounding yes. Jesus is faithful. Jesus is faithful even in the worst moment. Jesus is faithful even for the sake of those disciples who would betray him. In that last moment where he says, he tells the disciples that they are all going to betray them, he says, you are all going to abandon me, but then I will come to you in Galilee. I love that word. And actually, as the gospel ends, it kind of comes back. That's the thread that it comes back to. Go tell the disciples that I will see them in Galilee. I'm keeping that promise. And this promise that I gave to my brothers, in the very moment when I was talking about their weakness, that is the promise that I am now keeping. Jesus gives a word to his disciples. He wants them to know that, try to stay awake, but he wants them to know that even in their failure, that he will go on ahead of them and he will be faithful to him. Jesus will be faithful to you. And even in those moments where your faithfulness is falling apart, and even in those moments where it seems like the whole world is falling apart, Jesus is faithful. Who among us needs a faithful friend? Church, Jesus is calling us to come be faithful to Him. And Jesus is the one who says to us, stay awake. Be aware. Don't fool yourself. But press on. But Jesus is also the one that says to us, despite our weakness and our sin, He will be faithful to us. God will not abandon us. And that is the gospel of Jesus. Let's pray together. O faithful one, O God of our trust, in our darkest days let our eyes turn to You. In our most weary moments may You give us awareness and awakeness. Give us a relentlessly wakeful spirit. And O God, would You teach us by Your Holy Spirit which is within us, teach us what it means to be a faithful people. For we know that we owe it to You and that the world desperately needs to see faithfulness. So God, make it so among us. It may only be done by Your power. In the name of Jesus, the faithful one, we pray. Amen.